Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Roseville Wrecking Ball. The Roseville Wrecking Ball.
Joshua Shrum. He is a very talented steward, very knowledgeable.
The Roseville Wrecking Ball. This is one of those podcasts where I listen to every episode. I love what he's putting out there.
The Roseville Wrecking Ball. Josh Shrum.
Parcels of Knowledge. Does a fantastic job with that podcast.
The Roseville Wrecking Ball. He is an Article 8 scholar, and thank God. We need Article 8 scholars right now.
Tune into the Parcels of Knowledge podcast while you're on the route. That's the mailman's playbook, brother.
Good morning and welcome back to Parcels of Knowledge, that podcast dedicated to delivering knowledge to the city letter carrier with your host, the Roseville Wrecking Ball. Today we're on grievance number 171 for the year, and we're looking at, it's almost the end of April. It's 420, blaze it, fellas. But, we're coming up against the 1 year time period of this podcast being around. By the way, on Saturday, I'm going to have John Cruz on the podcast for their candidacy for NALC Trustee under the CLC Slate. So that's John Cruz. He will be coming on Saturday. I had a wonderful time with Chris Reed this last week. Unfortunately, we were supposed to have Ethel Bibbs, but there was a cancellation. But we're going to have John Cruz, and I think we've already confirmed a time and date to be recorded. Please send your questions in to rosevillewreckingball@yahoo.com. That's any and every question that you'd like to be answered. I'm going to be asking John Cruz this Saturday. All right, so let's talk about PS Form 1017B. That is the official record of unauthorized overtime. Lately, there's been a trend going on where management is trying to impress upper management by acting like they're holding carriers accountable to things that are actually not real. For example, they will tell the carrier that they have to get the job done after the carrier calls and lets them know that they're not going to be able to make it. And they will record that overtime as unauthorized overtime so that they can cover their butts and tell their bosses, yeah, I'm holding the carriers accountable. Now, that is inappropriate, and oftentimes unauthorized overtime records could lead to discipline. And that is part of the reason why it's inappropriate. There are two lines of thinking here. Some people will not file the grievance until discipline's issued, to which at that point they will point out the flaws in management's recording of 1017B. 1017B has a lot of different ways that it needs to be recorded and handled, and oftentimes management doesn't meet those prerequisites. And in not meeting those things, you can point out that there's a procedural flaw in determining, in recording this 1017B, so you can equate that to the handling of the authorization, that if they're not going to record it in such a manner that's in accordance with the handbooks and manuals, they're going to use the same amount of effort in establishing whether or not that overtime was authorized. So essentially, you're saying that they're bad at doing their job, and it kind of applies across the board, and that this will be a defense to any discipline that gets issued. The other line of theory is that you should be proactive with this and file them prior to discipline being issued. But the caveat with that is you're teaching them how to do it the right way each and every time you point out their flaws. So with that being said, let's go into, I'm going to do a grievance starter at the end of this. But before that, let's go into the controlling information as it relates to this issue. Important provisions to note, I would say take a look at the page 34 of the F401. It says employees are responsible for adhering to their assigned work schedules. A variance from the assigned work schedule will result in disallowed time or unauthorized time, overtime. So disallowed time is time that is recorded on the 1017A, and it's actually time that they actually remove from your pay. This is for doing things that are not actually work. Like, for example, if they watch you talking for 30 minutes, well, then they're going to record that with a 1017A and take 30 minutes of pay. 1017B is unauthorized overtime. It says PS Form 1017B, unauthorized overtime record, and take appropriate corrective action. All right, so unauthorized overtime. The Postal Service payroll policy requires time worked in excess of 8 hours in a service day or 40 hours in a service week to be paid at the overtime rate to eligible employees. Unauthorized overtime occurs when an employee's clock time exceeds 8 hours in a day or 40 hours in a week without prior authorization from a supervisor. By the way, when you're trying to let your management know, that is why you don't make any decisions yourself. You let them know, hey, look, you say on your 96, I'm 2 hours over. What are my instructions? They deny that 96, or maybe you forget to fill one out. And you're out on the route and you realize, yes, I'm going to still be 2 hours over. What do? You call the office. And in that case, you're covering your butt from unauthorized overtime. Never make a decision yourself. You can't fight this unauthorized overtime if it was actually unauthorized. So what you got to do is you call management or you text them, which is my preferred method of communication. Text them on a scanner. And you say, hey, that I'm going to be 2 hours over. What are my instructions? If they give you unclear instructions, for example, if they tell you, hey, make sure you finish it, but also do it in 8 hours, well, then you should have your ass covered from unauthorized overtime, and you are going to win a case like this. Now, if they tell you curtail the mail, bring it all back, you got to do that. You can't just work it and then say, hey, it's not unauthorized. That's the differentiation here. If you do what you're instructed at all times, you'll be fine. So going back to that 401, that time must be paid unless the employee supervisor observed or had reason to know that the employee did not work during the period in question. So we're going to skip employees must be paid for all work performed, even if the employee works overtime that was not authorized. When this occurs, supervisors must document the incident and take appropriate disciplinary action. Unauthorized overtime may not be disallowed simply because it is unauthorized. Penalty overtime may not be disallowed simply because it is unauthorized or because of local restrictions on the use of penalty overtime. PS Form 1017B, unauthorized overtime record, is designed to serve as a cumulative record of unauthorized overtime. Pause. Right there is one thing that I would like to point out. It says cumulative. Cumulative. I'm going to read pretty soon that it has to be kept in a binder. If it's kept in a binder and it serves as a cumulative record, typically what it would show is that the first entry would be the earliest date and the last entry would be the newest date. That's one thing that I'm finding management's doing incorrectly. They keep printing it off and acting like this is kept in a binder. Oftentimes it's not. But normally when they print it off, for some reason, their dumbass form is backwards. It has the newest one at the top, which would be entry number 1, and the oldest one at the bottom. That's the easiest way to tell that they're not recording it correctly. At least not in accordance with their procedure for record retention. Anyway, it says managers must establish a PS Form 1017B the first time a non-exempt employee receives unauthorized overtime. Subsequent incidences are documented on the established form. The PS Form 1017B is maintained in the same binder as PS Form 1017A. Document retention. PS Form 1017A and 1017B will be cut off at the end of each calendar year and new forms established for each employee as required. PS Form 1017A and 1017B must be retained for a period of 3 years from the end of the calendar year in which the last entry on the form is made. So these are forms that are on your record for 3 whole years. That's why it's important that they're accurate, because next time a new postmaster comes in, they can look at that record and say, oh shit, look at all these documented unauthorized overtimes. The next time he gets one, he's going to get written up. And by the way, not a single one could be appropriate to be on your record. So, we got to make sure we're keeping tabs on these things. So let's go to the handbook F21. Unauthorized work time. An employee who continues to work contrary to a direct order from his or her supervisor must be paid for all time worked, but may be subject to disciplinary action. In such cases, the supervisor must insert a written entry on Form 1017B. You see that? It says written entry. Again, that print off is not actually going to suffice. Now, will Step B support our argument, or an arbitrator even? I'm not sure. Haven't seen cases about it. So take that with a grain of salt, of course. Like anything you get on this podcast, a lot of these things come down to strategy rather than fact. But I am reading a lot of facts. All right, time entry card. When clock time is disallowed, the employee's supervisor must enter disallowed reason, confirm the time card of the amount of time to be disallowed in an appropriate reason code as shown. All right, so that's disallowed though. Form 1017B serves as a permanent cumulative record of unauthorized overtime. Supervisors must establish a Form 1017B whenever a non-exempt employee receives unauthorized overtime. The Form 1017B will be maintained together with the employee's Form 1017A. Postmasters are responsible for controlling the use of unauthorized overtime. Repeat occurrences should be corrected by discussion or appropriate disciplinary action as necessary. There you go. There's another spot that you're going to have a problem with. If they're putting these 1017Bs in, by the way, you'll find that on tax at the Employee Everything report. That's how they're trying to impress their bosses. It'll be on the tax. It'll say 1017B, or otherwise it will say unauthorized overtime record. Oftentimes, if they don't complete it, it'll say 1017B comments needed. That's another issue, because it does talk about filling them out correctly. But you need to be having discussions with employees. If this guy has 10 of them in the last month, and they haven't had a discussion or appropriate disciplinary action, that's telling, because it says right here you need to. Repeat occurrences should be corrected with discussions or appropriate disciplinary action. That goes along with the M39 section 115.1, where it says that the delivery manager must make every effort to correct the situation before resorting to disciplinary measures. That's another defense for discipline. Let's take a look on the instructions of the unauthorized overtime record. It says unauthorized overtime is time that an employee without prior authorization from a supervisor works in excess of a scheduled tour. Because work was performed, that time must be paid as unauthorized overtime. If a supervisor did not observe or have reason to know that no work was performed by the employee while on the clock, that time must be paid as unauthorized overtime. If no work was performed and the supervisor observed or had reason to know that no work was performed, the supervisor must disallow that time and record it on Form 1017A and take appropriate corrective action. All right. So, another provision I'd like to note is using people effectively, 115.2 of the M39. Managers can accomplish their mission only through the effective use of people. How successful a manager is in working with people will, to a great measure, determine whether or not the goals of the Postal Service are attained. And one of the basic things that are required, such as let the employee know what is expected of him or her. There you go. Know fully if the employee is not attaining expectations. Don't guess. Make certain with documented evidence. Let the employee explain his or her problem. Listen. If given the chance, the employee will tell you the problem. Draw it out if from the employee if needed, but get the whole story. All right, and also one other thing, 115.3, obligation to employees. When problems arise, managers must recognize that they have an obligation to their employees and to the Postal Service to look to themselves as well as to the employee to find out who, what, when, where, and why. Make absolutely sure you have the facts. The manager has a responsibility to resolve as many problems as possible before they become a grievance. And if the employees stand as merit, admit it and correct the situation. So in these cases where they're trying to impress their bosses, they're not really going along with most of these provisions. Now, Region 6 has given out grievance starters on this issue. I don't know if it's a national grievance starter or a Region 6 one, but I'm just going to read along and give you exemplary issue statements, facts, and contentions before we wrap it up. So if you have this issue, this is how you would file for it. Did management violate the M39 and M41 handbooks, M326, M1458, M1664, and M1769 via Articles 15 and 19 of the National Agreement by recording some or all of the overtime work by the grievant on a particular date as unauthorized on PS Form 1017B, and if so, what should the remedy be? And did management violate Section 115.4 of the M39 Handbook, M304, M1444, M1664, and M1769 via Articles 15 and 19 of the National Agreement by the manner used to make 3996 decisions and issue instructions on this particular date? And if so, what should the remedy be? All right, so here's the facts you could have. Don't get me wrong. If it doesn't fit your case, then it's not a fact that you're going to put down. So keep that in mind. It's going to be very particular to your situation. Okay, the grievant notified management of his or her inability to complete his or her assignment in 8 hours via PS Form 3996 on the day in question. Make sure to keep a copy of the PS Form 96 included in the case file. Management approved only this amount of time of the amount of time requested. The grievant needed to complete his or her assignment on the day in question. The grievant's reasons for his or her request for overtime or auxiliary assistance are listed on the PS Form 96. According to the grievance statement and the PS Form 3996 included in the case file, he or she couldn't complete their assignment in the approved time on that day in question. The grievant called back to the office to ask for further instructions and was directed to finish their assignment. The grievant followed their instructions. By the way, that's called unclear instructions if they tell you to finish the entire assignment in 8 hours, even though you're telling them you can't. That way, no matter what you do, it's inherent in their instructions because they were unclear. All right, so management recorded a particular amount of time, overtime, that the grievance worked on this particular date as unauthorized overtime on PS Form 1017B. Step 4 settlement, M document 326, states in relevant part, the grievant did inform management of their inability to complete their routes in 8 hours. Further, it was demonstrated that they were ordered by management to complete their routes. Although there was no expressed authorization to complete the delivery of mail on an overtime basis, the permissions would be inherent in the authorization to continue delivery after notification that the grievants were unable to complete the routes. That's what we're talking about. So here are the contentions that are suggested by this template, which, again, will be situational. So make sure you tailor it to your situation. Management violated national level settlements 1664 and 1769 by using the DOAS program to determine beginning, leaving, and return times for the grievant on the day in question. Management failed to consider and grant time for some of the reasons or elements contained on the PS Form 3996 for the grievant on the day in question. That aside, one of the inherent problems with making decisions using projections, as was done in this case, is that the projecting leave time in DOIS doesn't ever consider the actual leaving time of the letter carrier. Therefore, when a letter carrier is projected to leave the office at 8:30 in DOIS, but actually leaves the office at 9:30 due to the particular circumstances in the office that morning, the letter carrier is automatically denied that hour of time needed to complete their assignment. Street time projections are also flawed in DOIS. By way of example, DOIS street projections take no time consideration for the amount of DPS mail or circulars the letter carrier has to deliver on a given day. Accordingly, if a letter carrier normally gets around 1,200 pieces of DPS but receives 2,500 pieces of DPS on a given day, he or she would get no time to deliver it in DOIS. Additionally, DOIS projections do not consider the percent of coverage a letter carrier has on a given day. There are a host of other street factors that DOIS projections don't consider, such as weather conditions, traffic, road construction, growth, etc. Once again, the letter carrier is automatically denied the extra time needed to complete his or her work assignment when many different street time factors are present. DOIS will make the exact time projections for any route every day regardless of what circumstances are present. Then supervisors follow DOIS and don't consider any of the factors outlined above, as well as many others that are not specifically listed when making decisions on PS Form 3996. For all these reasons, the recording of time entered on PS Form 1017B as a result of the grievant not being able to complete their assignment in the time approved on the PS Form 3996 cannot stand. Rules must be reasonable. The rule that a letter carrier must make it back in the time approved on a 96, even when he or she calls for further instructions, is told to complete his or her assignment and follows the instructions given, under the circumstances surrounding this case, is not a reasonable rule. The idea that a letter carrier must make a certain office or street time projection regardless of above referenced circumstances violates the spirit and intent of National Settlements M304, 1444, 1664, and 1769, as well as the M39 and M41 handbooks. The supervisor was well aware of the work that needed to be performed. With this knowledge, the supervisor instructed the grievant to perform the work involved. Under these circumstances, it is inappropriate to record the street time performing the work as unauthorized on PS Form 1017B. The actual approval or authorization to work overtime to perform the work was inherent in accordance with Step 4 Settlement 326 included in the case file. The grievant notified management of his or her inability to complete his or her assignment as required by Section 131 of the M41 handbook. Management didn't act as required by Section 122 of the M39 handbook. Management used those projections to make decisions on the grievance 3996 requests and issued improper instructions to the grievant. The supervisor should tell a letter carrier in the morning, before he or she leaves the office, what to do with the mail if he or she is unable to comply with the instruction of being back at a certain time. If a supervisor instructs a letter carrier to curtail mail, he or she should tell the letter carrier how much mail to curtail and provide the letter carrier with the signed PS Form 1571 in accordance with Section 112 and 112J of the M39 handbook. If a supervisor doubts a letter carrier's effort, he or she has the right to do street supervision so long as it's open and above board, or better still, to get in the truck and ride with the letter carrier all day. None of this happened on the day in question. Management makes no allegation that the grievant engaged in any time-wasting practices on the day in question. And Section 115.4 of the M39 handbook requires managers to maintain an atmosphere of mutual respect for each other's roles and responsibilities. Management failed to follow this basic labor relations principle by placing the grievant in a catch-22 situation on that day in question. Management gave the grievant instructions that were impossible to follow in the morning on the day in question. This left the grievant with a choice of bringing back mail without authorization, delivering the rest of the mail without authorization, or calling back to the office for further instructions and following the instructions given. Regardless of which choice the grievant made, management would have recorded the overtime as unauthorized overtime on PS Form 1017B. This is a clear violation of Section 115.4 of the M39. Of course, as a remedy, you would ask that the record of unauthorized overtime be expunged from all employee records and files that particular day. That management and the installation cease and desist recording time on PS Form 1017B is unauthorized when the grievant is instructed to perform the work involved prior to performing the work. That management be required to issue reasonable and proper instructions when in the morning when requests for overtime auxiliary assistance are fully or partially denied in the future. And of course, if it goes to step B, you would ask whatever remedy the step B or arbitrator deems appropriate. Now, obviously, things you might want to request for information is a copy of the 96s, a copy of the everything reports, copy of the PS Form 1017B for the week, copy of the letter carrier's name, investigative interview, copy of the request for discipline for letter carrier, if there was a request for discipline, copy of the work hour workload report for the route and date, and a copy of the work hour status report, and any statements or interviews that you decide to conduct. Of course, these things are vastly dependent on whether or not your carrier, in fact, did work unauthorized overtime, or if there were unclear instructions. But, of course, everything is situational. You got to take everything with a grain of salt, and as a steward, that's part of your job. Just mold it to what your situation is. Don't forget, on Saturday, I got John Cruz coming on. He is going to be doing question and answer for his candidacy as trustee for the National Union, for the National NALC. And you guys are welcome to submit to him any questions you'd like. I will ask him each and every one. Hopefully you learned something valuable today. And as always, have a good day.
If these guys are getting educated, we will be in big trouble.
Management's been weighing you down like a bag of wet catalogs, but you don't gotta take it. You strap on the elbow of education, dig it?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Roseville Wrecking Ball. The Roseville Wrecking Ball.
The Roseville Wrecking Ball is an Article 8 scholar, and thank God, we need Article 8 scholars right now. The grievous genius, the Roseville Wrecking Ball, doing amazing work.
Tune into the Parcels of Knowledge podcast while you're on the route. That's the mailman's playbook, brother.